Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that drifts between the unusual and the slightly terrifying, but in a calm and almost sleepy way. So dim the lights and settle in with something warm to sip, because we are about to meet a queen who treated poison like tea and husbands like chess pieces. She was called Dynamis, though not many remember her name today, and perhaps that is for the best, because her life was a quiet kind of chaos and she ruled over the Crimea like a ghostly shadow with a very sharp edge. Imagine a palace where the servants moved silently across marble floors and the corridors, smelled faintly of herbs, and something sharper that you could not quite name because she was always testing small doses of things that would have ended ordinary people within hours. Dynamis was the daughter of Mithridates, a king who had the same obsession with immunity and poisons because apparently, in their family they liked to drink trouble in tiny sips rather than let it sneak up on them. She learned from him that survival could be engineered with careful measurement and patience, and she took that lesson seriously, perhaps a little too seriously, because she continued to practice for over 40 years of her life drinking poisons in quantities that would have killed anyone else, and yet somehow she smiled while doing it. The rumor was that she started with tiny doses of arsenic and slowly added other substances including snake venom and a few unpronounceable powders that made her pulse steady and her skin unchanged. While every would-be assassin who tried to strike succeeded only in making her stronger. It is difficult to imagine this routine as comforting, but for her it was ritualistic. And she performed it with the same casual attention one might give to brushing hair or adjusting a necklace before dinner. Some days she would sip while listening to her counsel discuss taxation, other days while reading letters from generals or spies or from husbands who hoped that love could save them from what they had not yet understood. And then there were the husbands. 22 husbands to be precise, and each one entered her life with a mix of ambition and hope that she was mortal, in the conventional sense, and each one left in a manner that made future suitors slightly more wary, though not enough to stop them from trying. In some accounts she smiled during their last meals in ways that were described as eerie, and in other accounts she simply maintained her composure, as if the sudden collapse of another man was a minor inconvenience rather than a lesson. The details are fuzzy because history remembers deeds differently when they are so entwined with fear, admiration, and horror. But what we do know is that she continued to marry men as a queen must do for alliances and appearances, and yet each knew. Husband had no idea that she had already rehearsed the science of his failure in advance. It was almost like watching nature unfold in slow motion with the predator hidden in plain sight while the prey remained perfectly oblivious until the very end. Despite her deadly routines, she was not a caricature of cruelty because she understood people in ways that most rulers did not. She listened to petitions, she negotiated truces, she laughed quietly at jokes she found clever, and she ruled Crimea with the kind of stability that comes from knowing exactly how fragile human life can be and how to hold it in one hand while still commanding armies and estates and treasures. Her courtiers learned quickly that flattery was useful, but fear was more effective if administered softly and with a smile. And she was careful to appear approachable to her people because there is a difference between being feared and being respected, and she wanted both without anyone guessing that she had already survived enough poisons to kill entire generations of her ancestors, if the idea had ever crossed their minds. Her beauty was noted by visitors and envoys and poets who traveled from distant cities to observe her and write in hushed tones about the slight curl of her lip, the cold precision of her eyes, and the aura of quiet menace that lingered just beneath the surface, like a secret kept too long. Yet she was human in her small indulgences, and sometimes laughed at herself for the lengths she went to in order to ensure survival. She kept diaries of the substances she experimented with, of the doses that were successful, and the ones that caused unpleasant side effects of husbands who had been overconfident and slightly foolish. It reads almost like a personal journal for a chemist, except her experiments were with life itself and with the human condition and with her own mortality as a subject that she tested over decades. And it was during one quiet evening after a council meeting when the last of her 22nd husbands had finally realized that she was untouchable in ways he could never be that she poured herself a glass of a new mixture, a blend she had been perfecting for months, and sipped it while watching the sunset reflect across the water. No one else was present in the palace. The corridors were silent except for the soft rustle of her robes. And in that moment, as she set the glass down, she noticed something unusual, a faint change in her pulse that made her pause because it had never wavered in decades, and she realized that even she might have underestimated the complexity of the substances she had mastered so carefully. It was not dangerous or alarming exactly, but it was enough to make her think that perhaps the years of immunity and careful calculation could have one misstep hidden in plain sight. And just as she was contemplating this small anomaly, she heard a sound at the end of the hall, a door creaking slightly, a shadow shifting, and she smiled. Because for the first time in many years, she was not entirely sure what it meant, and yet she felt alive in a way that only danger can provide, even if it is measured and indirect. And at that moment the candlelight flickered, as if warning her of a secret visitor coming toward her chambers. And she froze for just an instant, unsure if it was threat curiosity or perhaps the echo of her own legend returning to test her one last time. The shadow lingered at the end of the hall just long enough for Dynamis to consider whether it was curiosity imagination or the first hint of an actual threat she had not anticipated. Her hand rested lightly on the balustrade, and her eyes narrowed in a manner so calm that anyone watching would think she was simply observing a common household disturbance. But of course, it was not common, and she knew it even as she sipped the last traces of her carefully measured poison blend, which she kept in her favorite crystal cup, the one she had carried through decades of careful experiments and quiet victories. She took a deep breath and stepped forward because after 40 years of testing herself against substances that could have ended her life in an instant, she had learned that hesitation could be more dangerous than danger itself. The shadow moved again slowly, and she noticed a faint shimmer of clothing that did not belong to any servant or counselor she recognized, and in that moment her mind quietly catalogued possibilities while her body remained relaxed, as if the entire affair were simply another experiment in human behavior. Her new husband, if one could call him, that had been unusually quiet for someone who expected attention or influence, and perhaps that had been his first mistake. He had entered her life with confidence and a smile that underestimated the gravity of her decades of preparation, and he had assumed that her legendary immunity would not extend beyond her public reputation. But Dynamis knew better. She always knew better, and part of her pleasure came from seeing those assumptions crumble quietly and irrevocably. As she moved toward the shadow, she noted the slight tremor in the hand that held a letter or some small object. And she smiled internally because it was subtle enough to be overlooked, but obvious enough for someone trained in observation to see. The hallway itself seemed to stretch as she approached, and the tapestries on the walls depicted battles and alliances long past, that no one remembered fully, and yet the echoes of history hung around her like a soft cloak reminding her that her actions were now as much legend as record. When she finally stepped fully into the corridor, light revealed the figure more clearly, a young woman dressed in garments too fine for ordinary visitors, with hair that gleamed in the candlelight in a way that suggested it had been carefully groomed, and eyes that seemed to hold both reverence and fear. Dynamis paused and inclined her head slightly as if greeting someone at court, but not quite certain what their intentions might be. The girl spoke softly in a tone that was both polite and nervous, and explained that she had come with a message from a distant cousin, a minor noble in the north, who had information about the queen's lineage and the distant lands from which her father had once ruled. Dynamis listened carefully because over the years she had learned that seemingly trivial messages often contained more danger than declarations of war. And yet there was also a curiosity in her that had persisted even through decades of immunity tests, husband experiments, and quiet observation of human nature. It was not bravery exactly, but a methodical interest in how life unfolded when it dared to surprise her. The girl continued explaining details of an inheritance, a possible claim to territory, and hints of someone who might challenge the queen indirectly by questioning the origins of her immunity and her long history of husbands. Dynamis nodded occasionally and made soft, neutral sounds indicating she was listening, though her mind catalogued every word with precision. Of course, she already knew that challenges would arise eventually because power never remains uncontested. And history has a way of echoing in patterns so predictable that only those who observe closely notice the repetitions. She made the girl sit and offered tea, which she herself sipped, carefully measuring the effects of the water temperature and subtle herbs that calm nerves. It was an ordinary gesture on the surface, but her ability to remain calm was cultivated through years of exposure to substances and situations that would unravel any ordinary person in minutes. As the girl spoke further, it became apparent that the distant cousin had survived a collapse of family fortune and intrigue, and was sending what amounted to an invitation to a subtle game. Dynamis smiled faintly because she appreciated subtlety and understood that words could be more lethal than blades if used properly. The girl left eventually, and Dynamis returned to her chambers to consider the implications. She poured herself a small new mixture to maintain her immunity and reflected on the way. Alliances and threats often disguised themselves as routine communications. There was a faint thrill in realizing that even after decades of careful planning, life could still surprise her quietly, without drama, without noise, but with precision and consequence. She made notes in her journal about the encounter and measured doses of her daily regimen and wondered whether the distant cousin might be testing her or simply seeking her attention. The next morning brought sunlight through the tall windows of her chambers, and servants moving quietly across floors polished to a reflective shine. Dynamis observed the day unfold with a careful eye, noting which courtiers lingered a little too long, and which ones glanced repeatedly at her new husband, who remained cautiously obedient after the lessons of prior rulers. Breakfast was served, and she sipped tea again, noting the slight effect of an added herb that enhanced alertness without altering the calm she cultivated in every gesture and smile. She allowed herself a brief reflection on the 22 husbands she had outlasted and how each had underestimated her. It was not cruelty in the conventional sense, because she understood human nature better than most. It was observation, discipline, and the quiet execution of strategy over decades that defined her reign more than brute force or coercion. And yet, as the day progressed, a subtle series of events began to unfold. A servant misplaced an important letter, another whispered a name in the hallway, a minor dispute among the council revealed a hidden opinion that had gone unnoticed for decades. Dynamis noted these details with a faint smile and a light curiosity. It was a reminder that even with 40 years of immunity, carefully tested mixtures, and meticulous planning, she was not entirely in control. That realization brought a small thrill of anticipation, because it was the first time in decades that something felt like it might slip past her attention without being immediately obvious. And as evening approached, she felt the familiar pulse of adrenaline tempered by decades of experience, and realized that the day had brought a quiet anomaly, a small disturbance she could not yet fully identify or measure, but one that suggested even a queen who had survived every poison, every attempt, every overconfident husband might finally encounter something new just beyond the corridors of her carefully controlled life. The quiet anomaly lingered in Dynamis's mind as she prepared for the evening. Candles were lit throughout the palace, and their flickering light cast long shadows that seemed to move independently, as if testing her attentiveness. She moved slowly through her private corridors, inspecting each corner not out of fear but out of habit. Years of surviving subtle threats had sharpened her senses to a degree that made ordinary people uneasy without them realizing why. She passed tapestries depicting ancestors with serious faces and stiff poses that had once intimidated diplomats, and she smiled faintly at the irony that those who had painted history had no idea it could be observed so carefully from the shadows by someone who understood the meaning behind every line and gesture. Even after 40 years of careful experimentation with poisons, immunity, and human behavior, she remained fascinated by small disturbances in ordinary routines. They reminded her that life could be measured and controlled, yet still contained surprises. She returned to her chambers and checked the contents of her daily mixtures, measuring minute differences in arsenic concentration and observing the reactions of previously tested herbs. Nothing unusual appeared in the liquids themselves, yet she could not shake the sense that today had introduced something subtle and different. Her 22nd husband was nearby, moving carefully around the room with the habitual obedience that had become necessary over the years. He smiled at her quietly, but she responded with measured neutrality. Over decades, she had learned that emotional expression could be weaponized, and that a calm exterior often conveyed more than any words could. She sipped a carefully prepared potion and observed the gentle swell of her pulse, noting a rhythm she trusted from years of practice and testing. And still the sense of anomaly persisted, not in her body, but in the patterns of the day. Servants lingered slightly in hallways they should have passed quickly, courtiers whispered just below audibility, and a faint scent of an unfamiliar flower drifted through the air, though none should have been present in this season. By the late evening, she had decided to follow the disturbance with deliberate attention. A small note appeared on her desk, seemingly without explanation. The handwriting was precise, careful, and deliberate, though faintly unfamiliar. It suggested observation and calculation, much like her own. Dynamis picked it up slowly and read the words aloud in a soft monotone as if testing their meaning and rhythm. The message indicated that someone was watching the palace closely and knew more than they should about her daily routines and her mixtures. There was no threat directly expressed, only the suggestion that observation was occurring and that her empire of control was being quietly tested. Dynamis leaned back in her chair and considered the possibilities. It was rare to encounter an anomaly that could not be measured or categorized immediately, and rarer still to meet someone who seemed to understand the precision with which she conducted her life. She smiled faintly at the thought, because it was a challenge she had not felt in years. The note also contained a subtle hint about lineage and a distant connection to one of her earlier ancestors. Dynamis recognized the phrasing immediately as one used by minor nobles, attempting influence without direct confrontation. Her pulse remained steady and her expression neutral. She placed the note down and poured herself another carefully measured sip of her daily mixture. Because habit was habit, and routines offered a sense of control even when anomalies appeared. Over decades, she had perfected the art of anticipating human error, and she understood that the subtlety of the message indicated patience and careful observation by the writer. Her mind cataloged the details of handwriting, pattern, phrasing, and timing with a quiet fascination. She considered that someone had probably spent weeks preparing this single intervention, testing her reactions and gathering information about routines. It was methodical and deliberate, but not yet threatening in a direct manner, which made it more interesting than any previous attempt to challenge her authority. That night she slept lightly in her chambers, aware of every creak and rustle and the soft shifting of shadows cast by moonlight on polished floors. The feeling of anomaly did not leave her, and she found herself awake in the middle of the night, sipping a small quantity of her mixture while listening carefully to distant noises that might have been ordinary or might have been part of a calculated intrusion. The sense of challenge excited her quietly. She had outlasted every threat for decades and survived every attempt on her life by people who underestimated her ability to anticipate and adapt. And now something small had slipped into her meticulously controlled world, and she was determined to understand it fully. The palace seemed to breathe with a quiet energy, as if aware of her attention and perhaps even responding subtly to her observation. Early the next morning, the anomaly made itself clearer. A servant had accidentally left a window slightly ajar, a note was missing from its usual place, and a minor council member lingered where they should not have been. These events were individually minor, but collectively they indicated deliberate testing. Dynamis walked through her chamber's corridors and gardens, with careful eyes cataloging patterns and assessing intentions. She noted the subtle difference in the temperature of her mixture and the reaction it caused, which she recorded in her diary with her habitual precision. There was a thrill in discovering that even after 40 years of careful planning, an element of surprise could exist in her environment and in human behavior around her. She considered whether it was a student of poisons, a distant relative, or perhaps someone entirely unknown to her lineage. The thought was both entertaining and intriguing in the calmest possible way. By afternoon, she realized that someone was attempting to gain information, not to strike immediately, but to study her reactions and habits over a prolonged period. This was rare and required patience. Dynamis sat in her chamber sipping tea, carefully noting the effect of the herbs she added on her senses and the subtle differences in rhythm of her pulse. She smiled faintly to herself because the challenge was unusual but welcomed. Something small had entered her domain, and it could not be measured immediately. And as she looked toward the end of her hall, a shadow passed in the candlelight and paused, just long enough to make her aware that the observer might be closer than she imagined. The shadow lingered just beyond the light of the tall windows in Dynamis' corridor, and she moved forward slowly with measured steps, because 40 years of practice had taught her that haste could ruin even the most carefully controlled situation. The faintest hint of movement caught her eye, and she noted it without alarm, simply as data to be observed and recorded. Her pulse remained steady, and she sipped a tiny portion of her daily mixture to maintain equilibrium, as she had done countless times before. The palace was quiet except for the soft echo of her own footsteps on polished floors and the occasional murmur of distant servants carrying out routine tasks. She observed the flickering light and how it interacted with the shadow, noting angles and the possible source of disturbance. Everything was small, subtle, and deliberate, like the first notes of a song that would eventually become clear if one listened long enough. She approached the shadow and realized it was closer than she had anticipated, a small figure barely visible in the corner of her vision. Dynamis tilted her head slightly and regarded it with the calm attention of someone watching an experiment unfold. The figure did not move aggressively, did not shout, did not even speak. It simply lingered, waiting or observing or testing her in some way that was unfamiliar. She could feel the curiosity rising gently like a tide, and she allowed herself a faint smile. Because challenges were entertaining when measured and controlled, and this one had entered her domain without revealing its full intent. She did not rush, she did not strike, she did not call for guards. She merely observed and catalogued, noting every minute detail of posture, gesture, and hesitation as if reading a page of history written in human form. The figure finally stepped forward slowly, and she recognized it as the same young messenger who had delivered the note the previous day. But now there was something different, something more deliberate in the way the girl moved, as if she had rehearsed the encounter and wanted to measure the queen's response in real time. Dynamis inclined her head slightly and allowed her eyes to soften in what she hoped appeared as casual attention, though internally she catalogued every micro-expression, noting subtle signs of confidence, nervousness, or curiosity. The girl spoke softly, announcing that she had more information to convey, that it could affect succession and property and the history of the queen's line in ways that were subtle yet significant. Dynamis listened in quiet monotone, as she always did, processing the words not as threats but as variables in the ongoing experiment of human behavior that her life had become. She asked questions carefully and softly, in a rhythm that encouraged honesty without causing alarm. The girl answered each query with attention to detail and even slight embellishment that suggested she knew the value of subtlety and influence. Dynamis observed everything and recorded mental notes on the possible meaning and implications of each word and gesture. She sipped her mixture again, noting the effect on her senses and keeping her pulse steady while allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. There was no excitement, no dramatics, only measured observation and the faint thrill of encountering a variable in her carefully controlled world that she could not immediately quantify. It was rare in her long life, and she savored it quietly like a small secret known only to herself. As the conversation concluded, the girl left the corridor, quietly closing the door without sound, and Dynamis returned to her chambers to consider the implications. She poured herself a carefully measured amount of her mixture and reflected on the anomaly that had entered her life. For decades, she had survived poisons tested against her body, studied human error, and outlasted 22 husbands, each one overconfident and unaware of the precise calculation required to live beside her. And yet this small figure had introduced a new variable, not with violence or deception, but with subtlety, patience, and observation. The realization reminded her that even the most controlled life could encounter novelty in forms that were quiet, measured, and indirect. By evening, she decided to follow the clues laid out by the messenger and review her records of marriages, alliances, and mixtures, noting patterns she might have overlooked. She moved deliberately through her chambers, corridors, and library and began writing in her diaries, recording every detail of timing, phrasing, and observed behavior from the day. There was a thrill in this work because it reminded her that life was still capable of delivering surprises that could not be fully anticipated, even by someone who had mastered decades of controlled experimentation with poisons and human behavior. And as night fell, she noticed a faint sound coming from the far wing of the palace, a soft creak followed by a shadow crossing the wall. And she froze with measured attention, noting that the anomaly was moving again, not randomly but with purpose, as if inviting her to observe and respond. The shadow in the far wing remained just beyond clear sight, and Dynamis moved toward it with deliberate slowness. Her footsteps echoed faintly across polished floors, and she noted each sound with careful attention, because even in routine movements there were lessons about timing and observation that only someone trained in patience could see. She paused briefly at the base of the staircase and observed the flicker of candlelight against the walls, noting how the shadow shifted in relation to the angle of the flame. The subtle movements suggested intelligence rather than accident, and that piqued her interest more than any direct threat could have done. She took a measured sip of her mixture, noting that the effect on her senses remained predictable and comforting even in the presence of anomaly. There was a quiet pleasure in knowing that decades of preparation had made her body reliable, even as her mind contemplated uncertainty. The figure revealed itself slowly as she ascended the staircase, a faint outline against the dim light. Dynamis noted the posture and the rhythm of the steps, with the same meticulous attention she had applied to her poisons mixtures and even the subtle habits of her 22 previous husbands. Each detail was a variable, a piece of information she could interpret and test. The figure paused and spoke softly, identifying herself as the messenger who had delivered the note days before. But now her voice carried the faintest hint of expectation. She seemed to understand that the queen would analyze each word, gesture, and pause with extreme care, and perhaps she had rehearsed this encounter to see how observation and human instinct intersected in someone so trained. Dynamis inclined her head slightly and responded with calm, measured words, allowing the interaction to unfold slowly without interruption or alarm. The young woman explained that there were matters of distant succession and hidden lineage that required subtle attention, and that careful observation would reveal truths about the queen's ancestry that might otherwise go unnoticed. Dynamis listened with soft, neutral acknowledgement, recording mental notes as she always did. There was no overt threat, only the faintest sense that someone had studied her routines for weeks, if not months, in order to approach with precision. It was unusual in its subtlety, and that made it intriguing in a way she had not experienced for decades. She sipped her mixture again and noted a familiar warmth settle through her chest. It was comforting, the ritual of measured intake, a quiet constant amidst novelty. And yet the novelty itself brought a faint thrill, the kind of attention that tested her perception without causing real disruption. The young woman lingered at the top of the staircase with patience and decorum, as if awaiting guidance. Dynamis considered carefully whether to invite her further into the chambers or to maintain the distance that preserved calm observation. She chose the middle path, allowing the messenger to approach slowly while continuing to assess posture, facial expression, and voice modulation. Every detail was catalogued and every hesitation noted, because it was unusual to encounter someone capable of deliberate subtlety in a world where most people acted impulsively. Dynamis appreciated the quiet skill that the messenger displayed, because in 40 years she had learned that intelligence often disguised itself as hesitation, and that patience was more effective than aggression. After several minutes of measured observation, Dynamis spoke softly, inviting the girl to share the information she carried in full detail. The girl stepped closer and began recounting stories of distant estates, potential heirs, and obscure alliances that might affect future claims. Each sentence was deliberate, precise, and contained hints of observation that indicated careful preparation. Dynamis listened attentively, recording everything in her mind, noting which elements were likely factual, and which might be intentionally misleading or incomplete. She sipped her mixture again, noting the effect on her senses and maintaining her steady pulse while allowing the conversation to unfold in real time. There was a quiet fascination in observing human behavior under self-imposed scrutiny and seeing it performed by someone trained enough to understand the significance of every gesture and word. As the evening wore on, the girl concluded her account and left the corridor, quietly closing the door behind her without sound. Dynamis returned to her chambers and poured herself a measured portion of her mixture, noting that her body responded with the usual predictability, while her mind considered the implications of the day. It was rare to encounter subtlety in a palace where most movements were dictated by habit, obligation, or fear. And yet the quiet anomaly persisted, and she realized that someone had entered her carefully measured domain and tested her in ways that required patience, observation, and precise assessment. She smiled faintly because the challenge was unusual, but welcomed, and she resolved to investigate further in the coming days to see what patterns might emerge. By midnight, she was awake again, quietly observing her chambers, corridors, and gardens, noting minor irregularities that could have been overlooked by anyone less attentive. A candle flickered, and shadows shifted in ways that suggested someone had moved silently through the palace, even if no one had been seen. She measured her pulse and sipped her mixture, noting the comforting familiarity of routine while simultaneously recognizing that a new variable had entered her environment. It was small, subtle, and deliberate, and it promised to unfold slowly, revealing new challenges that even her 40 years of preparation could not fully anticipate. The palace was silent, except for the faint echo of wind brushing against tall windows and the soft hum of candles flickering in their holders. Dynamis moved slowly through her chambers, noting the subtle shifts in shadows, as if the building itself had decided to whisper to her. Every step she took was measured, deliberate, and quiet, because she had learned that small details often revealed more than loud movements ever could. Her pulse remained calm and steady, and she sipped a measured portion of her mixture, noting that the warmth settled predictably in her chest, even as her mind catalogued the subtle irregularities of the night. A curtain fluttered slightly, though no breeze should have been present, and she paused, noting the direction of light and the possibility of a distant observer. She followed the subtle signs to the end of the corridor, where a faint disturbance suggested movement just beyond sight. Her eyes narrowed, gently observing angles and reflections from polished floors and brass handles. It was a quiet test, and she understood immediately that the palace had become a stage for a delicate performance in which she herself was the central observer. The previous days of subtle messages, notes, and the measured presence of the young messenger had set the stage, and now something intangible was unfolding. Dynamis inhaled slowly, allowing her senses to absorb every detail of light, shadow, and sound. She noted a faint smell of unfamiliar incense that might have been intentional or might have been residual from a visitor she had not yet accounted for. It was small and quiet, but enough to demand attention from someone trained to measure variables with precision. As she advanced carefully through the hall, she observed the faint outline of a figure reflected in the polished surfaces. It was not clear whether the figure had moved intentionally to be observed, or if it was simply a trick of light. Dynamis tilted her head slightly and observed the rhythm of her own breath, noting subtle changes in pulse that allowed her to remain calm while cataloging the movements of the shadow. She sipped her mixture again, noting the effect on her senses and the familiar warmth in her chest. The palace remained quiet except for small sounds that could have been ordinary or could have been deliberate tests of her attention. The thrill of anomaly persisted quietly, and she welcomed it in a way that only someone with decades of preparation could. The figure shifted and paused near the stairwell just long enough to suggest intent without revealing details. Dynamis moved slowly and quietly, observing posture, expression, and the faintest hint of hesitation. Every detail was data, every pause meaningful. She noted the careful rhythm in which the figure moved and considered that it might have been trained to enter and observe without causing alarm. The subtlety was unusual, and she appreciated the sophistication of the performance because in 40 years few had attempted such careful observation without overstepping. She sipped her mixture again and felt the comforting routine of decades settle in, even as curiosity gently stirred. By the time she reached the base of the stairwell, she realized that the figure was gone. But the disturbance had left traces in scent, sound, and the slight misalignment of objects in the corridor. Dynamis cataloged these traces with precise attention, recording mental notes for patterns that might emerge over the coming days. There was no panic, no surprise, just the quiet thrill of a variable that had entered her controlled world and was testing her ability to respond without overreaction. She returned to her chambers to consult her diaries and review mixtures, noting that even her body responded predictably while her mind embraced the subtle novelty. The following day she began to reconstruct the events of the night, observing small details that had previously gone unnoticed. A faint scuff mark on polished floors, a slight tilt in a vase, and the subtle alignment of shadows suggested deliberate movement. Dynamis sipped her morning mixture, noting the usual calming warmth, and considered the possibilities. It was rare to encounter someone capable of planning subtlety over time, and the presence of this unknown variable promised new challenges that could not be fully anticipated. She moved through her chambers, corridors, and gardens, observing courtiers, servants, and even her husband with careful eyes, noting minor irregularities and potential patterns. By evening, she had identified a series of inconsistencies that suggested observation and testing rather than direct threat. A soft knock at the door introduced the young messenger once again, and Dynamis invited her in with quiet neutrality. The girl's eyes held a faint glimmer of anticipation, as if she knew the queen would catalog every detail of her arrival and departure. They spoke softly and slowly with attention to phrasing and rhythm. Dynamis observed every gesture and pause while sipping her mixture, noting the familiar warmth and steady pulse. She realized that the messenger's visit was another layer in the subtle game of observation and measurement that had quietly entered her life, and she allowed herself a faint smile at the cleverness involved. As night fell, the palace seemed to breathe with quiet awareness, and the shadows lengthened. Dynamis returned to her chambers and poured a final portion of her mixture for the day, noting that even in the calm routine she could feel the presence of subtle observation lingering just beyond the edges of her perception. A faint sound echoed from the far wing, the softest possible disturbance, and she froze, noting angles, shadow, and timing. The anomaly was not gone. It had merely shifted and persisted in measured ways that promised to reveal new information over time. Dynamis allowed herself a faint thrill at the prospect, because even after 40 years of immunity, careful calculation, and the outlasting of 22 husbands, the quiet challenge of subtle human observation could still excite her in ways nothing else could. The far wing remained quiet except for the faintest whisper of movement barely perceptible against the night. Dynamis moved slowly through the corridor, noting every subtle change in shadows and light. Her eyes measured angles and shifts as she had done countless times before, and her pulse remained calm and steady. She sipped a small portion of her daily mixture and felt the familiar warmth settle predictably in her chest, while her mind catalogued each minor irregularity as data. The palace felt alive tonight, as if every wall, corridor, and window had conspired to test her attention and patience. She allowed herself to smile faintly at the thought. Even after decades of careful planning and 22 husbands who underestimated her, the world still found ways to introduce novelty. At the end of the corridor she paused and observed a faint silhouette shifting against the wall. It was slow, deliberate, and precise in its timing, suggesting intent rather than accident. Dynamis noted posture, expression, and the angle of light as the figure moved slightly closer. She inhaled calmly and allowed the familiar rhythm of her body to steady her mind. The shadow lingered near the stairwell and then retreated just enough to remain partially obscured. The subtlety was unusual, and she appreciated the discipline required to maintain it. Most people acted impulsively or loudly, which was easily observed and predictable. The skill of this unknown presence intrigued her because it required patience, careful measurement, and understanding of human behavior, all qualities she valued highly. She took another measured sip of her mixture, noting the usual warmth and calm it brought, while considering the possibilities. The shadow could be the young messenger returning with further information, or someone entirely new. It could be a test from an ally or a distant relative, or simply an observer seeking to measure her reaction. Dynamis allowed herself the quiet thrill of uncertainty because it was rare in a world where she had mastered control over poisons, mixtures, and human behavior. Every movement, sound, and pause was catalogued mentally as she advanced slowly toward the stairwell. Her steps were light and measured, and her eyes never left the faint silhouette. Even the small creak of the floorboards was noted for angle and intensity. At the base of the stairwell, the shadow seemed to pause and shift as if inviting observation. Dynamis inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, and spoke softly in a tone that was calm and neutral, allowing the figure to reveal itself. A faint rustle and a whisper identified the visitor as the young messenger once again, but this time with a new quality of confidence in movement and tone. She explained that there were details about inheritance, distant claims, and ancestral connections that required careful attention and subtle assessment. Dynamis listened quietly and catalogued each word, gesture, and hesitation as she sipped her mixture, noting that her body remained calm even as her mind traced the possibilities. She recognized immediately that the messenger had studied her patterns carefully and was testing her responses deliberately. The girl moved closer with careful steps and spoke softly, describing potential succession disputes and obscure family claims. Dynamis observed her eyes, hands, and posture, noting precision of movement and timing of phrasing. Every small gesture was meaningful, and her mind recorded details for analysis. The subtlety of approach reminded her of her early years with her first husbands, who had all underestimated her skill and knowledge in measurement, observation, and prediction. The messenger's quiet confidence was unusual because most people approached directly or carelessly. This approach required intelligence, discipline, and patience, all qualities that made the anomaly entertaining rather than threatening. As the night deepened, Dynamis allowed the conversation to unfold with careful observation. She noted timing, inflection, and micro-expressions, and recorded them mentally while sipping her mixture. Her pulse remained steady, and her mind catalogued every detail. The palace was quiet except for the soft echo of steps and the occasional distant shift of furniture or faint whisper. By the end of the conversation, the messenger left with measured care, closing the door without sound. Dynamis returned to her chambers to consult her diaries and mixtures, noting that her body responded predictably, even as her mind considered the new information. She realized that the anomaly was persistent, patient, and deliberate. As she moved through her chambers and corridors, she observed small details indicating previous presence of the shadow. A faint scent slightly out of place, a minor misalignment of objects, a subtle mark on polished floors all suggested deliberate movement. She sipped her mixture again and catalogued these traces, noting patterns for the coming days. There was no panic or alarm, only the calm thrill of anomaly and subtle testing. Even after 40 years of immunity, careful preparation, and surviving 22 husbands, her attention was engaged fully by the quiet game that had entered her life. By midnight, a soft noise echoed from the far wing, and she froze, noting the angles, shadows, and timing. The anomaly was moving once again, not by accident, but with purpose, and the next phase of observation had begun. The faint noise in the far wing drew Dynamis slowly from her chambers with measured steps. Each footfall was deliberate and silent, and her eyes scanned shadows and corners for any irregularity. The palace felt unusually alive tonight, as if every wall and corridor had conspired to whisper secrets she had not yet catalogued. She sipped her mixture, carefully noting the warmth that settled predictably in her chest and the calm steadiness of her pulse. Even after decades of experimentation with poisons, careful measurement of every mixture, and surviving 22 husbands who had underestimated her, the thrill of subtle anomaly remained, engaging in ways nothing else could. It was small, quiet, and deliberate, yet it demanded attention and careful observation. As she moved through the dim corridor, the faintest shadow flitted across the polished floors. Dynamis tilted her head, slightly noting its angle, shape, and timing. Her mind catalogued details carefully as she continued to advance without hurry. The shadow paused just beyond the reach of candlelight, as if inviting her to measure its intent. She observed posture and the barely perceptible movement of hands and shoulders, noting precision that suggested deliberate training. It was rare to encounter someone capable of moving so quietly and purposefully, and she allowed herself a faint smile at the sophistication of the challenge. She sipped her mixture again and allowed her pulse to settle in calm rhythm while her mind traced possibilities. The figure emerged faintly from the shadows, a silhouette almost indistinguishable from the surrounding darkness, except for subtle movement. Dynamis noted the slow, steady steps and soft cadence of breath. She recognized immediately that the presence was deliberate observation, not intrusion, not chaos. It was patience and subtlety applied in ways she had rarely experienced. She spoke softly, inviting the figure to reveal itself fully, and waited while continuing to monitor every microgesture, posture, and pause. Each small movement was significant, and she catalogued them carefully, as if reading an experimental record written in human form. The rhythm of observation and measurement was familiar and comforting, even as novelty entered her life. The figure finally stepped into clearer light, revealing a face that was unfamiliar yet deliberate in expression and posture. Dynamis noted confidence tempered by subtle respect and the precise timing of gestures. The visitor spoke softly, explaining that further information regarding distant claims, ancestral lineage, and succession required subtle attention and patient observation. Dynamis listened quietly, recording each phrase, intonation, and hesitation as her mind catalogued patterns and potential implications. She sipped her mixture again, noting the familiar warmth and steady rhythm while observing the interaction with meticulous care. The sophistication of the approach intrigued her. It required patience, careful calculation, and subtlety in ways she had long expected to be unnecessary at her age. By late evening, the conversation concluded with soft words and measured gestures. The figure retreated quietly, leaving subtle traces in scent, shadow, and misalignment of objects. Dynamis returned to her chambers to review notes, mixtures, and observations with habitual precision. She reflected on the quiet anomaly that had entered her life and recognized its persistence and deliberate design. Even after 40 years of careful preparation, surviving 22 husbands, and cultivating immunity, her attention was fully engaged. She catalogued minor irregularities in floor polish, alignment of objects, and faintly displaced curtains. Each detail added to a pattern she could track over time. As night deepened, a faint echo suggested movement in the far wing again. Dynamis paused, sipped her mixture, and allowed her mind to catalogue angle, shadow, and timing. The anomaly had returned and was testing her once again. There was no alarm, only curiosity and anticipation in the calm, monotone way that defined her attention to detail. She moved toward the source, slowly noting soft shifts in candlelight and subtle sounds in polished floors. Her pulse remained steady and her body responded predictably to the mixture. The palace felt like a stage set for careful observation and patient engagement. Even after decades of mastery, the quiet presence promised new discoveries if she remained attentive and measured. Dynamis stepped once more into the corridor with the same measured patience that had carried her through decades of calculated survival. She tasted the last trace of her mixture on her tongue and allowed the familiar calm to settle across her thoughts like warm fog. The far wing breathed with that subtle rhythm of life again, not chaotic, not rushed. Just quietly present like a companion too polite to speak first. The faint shift of weight against the polished floor was barely audible, yet perfectly placed as though the intruder respected her expertise and wished to be recognized without spectacle. Dynamis appreciated the courtesy, even if she did not yet understand the intent. She walked slowly and unhurried, noting how the sound paused as she paused, creating a shared cadence that felt almost conversational. She reached the junction where light from the high windows spilled in thin silver bars across marble. Shadows gathered there like handwritten notes left for her alone. A curtain edge was out of place again. She paused to smooth it with fingertips that still held a slight bitter scent from her nightly tonic. Every fabric fold returned to perfect alignment, and she considered that the intruder had touched it deliberately, not clumsily, not accidentally, as if encouraging her to follow like a scholar marking pages for later study. Dynamis inhaled softly and continued. She had studied poisons, empires, and men, but this subtle invitation was a different subject entirely. It required patience. She had always excelled at patience. Down the hall she found a single candle burning where no flame should have been left unattended. It flickered in the draft like a nervous thought. She leaned close, wax still warm, wick trimmed too neatly to be random. The gesture was careful, considerate, and intelligent. She admired it in the quiet way she admired well-built locks or efficiently measured antidotes. She extinguished the candle with 2 fingers and placed it aside. Her steps resumed, slow, listening, measuring. The figure appeared once more, though not fully. Only a temple, the curve of a cheek, the outline of a shoulder reflected faintly in the tall window. She did not rush. They did not flee. Both simply existed in parallel silence, like notes in a score that knew exactly when not to sound. Dynamis let the moment breathe. She asked nothing. She demanded nothing. Yet presence itself was communication, and she understood languages that required no words. At length, she returned to her chambers with a pace that betrayed neither fear nor urgency. She prepared another mixture, though her immunity made it unnecessary. Habit, comfort, knowledge, and control were reasons enough. She brewed quietly, herbs crushed with slow precision, steam rising like memory. The palace was still but not asleep. A thought unfolded inside her like an old page reopening. After 22 husbands and countless attempted poisonings, she had not expected curiosity to survive within her like this slow, persistent warmth. Yet, there it was. Unrushed and entirely welcome, morning came thin, gray, gentle. She ate fruit in silence. No hurry, no conversation. She kept a careful record of the night in her ledger. Small handwriting, clinical but patient. Movement recorded, candle placement noted. Curtain displacement measured. A pattern was forming, though incomplete. She let the puzzle remain unfinished, because unanswered questions were often more interesting than solved ones. She needed more time, more nights, more observation. By mid-afternoon, she walked through the gardens, inspecting roses she had once infused with micro-doses of rare toxins to test guilt and greed in political guests. Dew clung to petals in clear beads like tiny unspoken thoughts. She touched one gently and watched how it trembled, but did not fall. She liked small details that held despite pressure, strength in quiet forms, survival without spectacle. The garden paths curled ahead like sentences she had not yet read. She sensed him before she saw him this time. Breath steady behind the hedgerow. Step placed with intention. Patience mirrored her own. She admired that. She turned slowly, and there he stood, not hidden, just present. A man of calm posture and measured gaze. He bowed without exaggeration, respect without submission. His voice when he finally spoke carried no urgency, only information. News from distant borders, claimed relatives. A boy, quiet by nature, observant to dangerous degrees. And for the first time in 40 years, Dynamis felt something unexpected. Not alarm, not suspicion, but recognition. He spoke of lineage records unearthed in an abandoned estate beyond northern marshlands. Documents sealed under dust and wax, a name that echoed faintly in her memory. A branch of her bloodline she had never catalogued, a possibility, thin but persistent like the shadow in her halls. She listened without interruption, hands folded neatly against cool stone. Every sentence placed like stepping stones across water she had never crossed. When he finished, he handed her a folded parchment. No embellishment. Just information. Clean. Precise. She approved of that. She returned indoors, slowly reading the parchment under even light. Ink faded but legible. A genealogy map. A missing link. A child born to a cousin she believed long dead. If the branch had survived quietly, then the boy might exist still. Observation required. She closed the parchment with care. Another subject for her ledger. Another night for her halls. She felt no rush. Answers would come like candle flames. One at a time. Controlled. Measured. Predictable only when observed. Evening drew itself across the palace again with long quiet strokes like someone painting dusk by hand. Dynamis drank her mixture. Slower this time. Not from necessity but anticipation. The far wing would breathe again. Patterns would unfold. She would watch and wait. And tomorrow perhaps she would ask a question she had not asked in years. Not about poison. Not about power. But about the boy who might be her last unfinished story. She sipped. Listened. The footsteps returned. Soft. Polite. Waiting. Night returned like a memory that had never really left. It moved through the corridors with patient feet, and the palace settled under its weight like an old cat finding a familiar resting place. Dynamis stood by the tall window overlooking the gardens where flowers now lay folded inward like sleeping thoughts. The air held that same expectant stillness from the night before, and the footsteps she waited for made no attempt to rush or surprise. They would come. They always came. She simply breathed and watched the glass reflect a version of herself that looked almost softer in candlelight. The poison queen who no longer needed poison. The strategist who no longer sought to conquer. A mind trained to anticipate disaster, now waiting instead for revelation. Like a student waiting for a teacher who walks slowly on purpose. When the footsteps began, she felt no rise in pulse. Calm was her oldest habit. They were closer now than any previous night, more present, less shy, like a conversation drawing its second breath. She stepped away from the window and moved into the corridor with the same measured pacing that had become her language. The palace answered in silence. Her steps like a metronome. There's mirroring a respectful distance behind. A dialogue built not from words but from proximity. She descended the grand staircase without glancing back because she understood the rules of this new game. If she turned too soon, the moment would collapse. If she pressed too fast, it would scatter like startled birds. Curiosity must be fed with stillness. She reached the base of the staircase and paused beneath the chandelier where crystals reflected candlelight in patient fragments. That was where the figure stopped too. Close enough for intention, far enough for restraint. She could feel their gaze, but she did not meet it. Not yet. Dynamis walked to the solar room where she kept maps of kingdoms now long dissolved. Dust settled there thick like old flour, but she did not brush it away. Preservation through silence. She laid the parchment of the bloodline map on the table and waited. She felt rather than heard the presence step into the room. Slow, soft. A breath not quite deep enough to be tension. She did not ask them to speak. Silence was a blade that revealed more than voices ever could. She traced a single finger across the parchment, following a line that led to the unknown descendant. The boy. The possibility. And she knew without logic or proof that the figure behind her was connected. But connection was not proof, and she had never once in her calculated life acted on assumption. Instead, she spoke her first words of the night in a tone as soft as folded linen. A name from the parchment. A fragile thread. It lingered between them like a note plucked from a single string. She heard a shift in breathing. The slightest confirmation. Not spoken, not bold, but real. Dynamis allowed herself one quiet exhale that might have been satisfaction. The figure moved close enough that she could sense warmth, though not close enough to touch. They set something on the table beside the parchment. She looked down and saw a small object, no larger than a ring box carved of pale wood with patterns too careful to be decorative. Work born of patience. Work that reminded her of her own youth when she carved initials into the spine of her first journal, with a needle stolen from her tutor's desk. She opened the box. Inside lay a thin coil of red thread tied at both ends. A symbol, a promise. A claim of lineage, perhaps. Or a challenge. She turned the box in her hands, feeling the smooth surface worn by someone who had carried it long. The figure remained still like a candle that refused to flicker. Dynamis considered this very carefully. Across years, she had learned the quiet art of threat. The quieter, the deeper. And this was not a threat. It was something else entirely. Recognition, maybe. Or invitation. She placed the thread gently on the parchment, letting the map and the symbol breathe in the same space. The figure finally stepped forward into the faintest line of light, and she saw only enough to know they were young. Younger than her by decades. Eyes steady, shoulders relaxed. Not a spy. Not an assassin. Someone seeking answer, not advantage. He held no blade. No letter, only silence shaped like patience. Then he bowed with a level of restraint she respected deeply. He spoke only 3 words. Quiet. Unrushed. Words that carried no urgency but changed the direction of her night. Like a hinge turning a door. Mother of my mother. Dynamis did not blink. Shock was a luxury she never indulged publicly. Instead she asked only one question. Simple. Precise. His age. 15, almost 16. A boy. A descendant. A surviving thread of her bloodline woven through history without her knowledge. He stood there small compared to her legacy, yet unshaken as though he carried storms calmly in pockets. She gestured for him to sit. He obeyed with the ease of someone who understood power but did not fear it. They sat across from each other with the parchment and the red thread between them like a bridge not yet tested for weight. She asked nothing more for now. Information layered itself clearer with silence than interrogation. She poured him tea not poisoned, not tempered, only simple leaves steeped in clean water. He drank without hesitation, bold, strange, familiar. She watched the movement of his hand, the way fingers curled around ceramic like memory. That gesture she recognized. Her father's had it. A detail so small she had not realized she remembered until she saw it reflected. The palace around them held its breath. No night in 40 years had carried this shape. She wondered how long he had known of her, how long he had searched, why he had watched the halls instead of presenting himself sooner. But she did not ask. Not yet. Patience was the soil where truth took root. She instead said one simple sentence. Stay until morning. Not as command. Not as welcome, as a test. He nodded once. Calm. She stood and he followed the way shadow does. She led him through corridors not as a queen, but as a scholar guiding a student who might one day surpass her. His footsteps remained soft, but no longer distant. Their rhythm aligned. Night softened at the edges. The palace felt less like stone and more like memory. She paused at the threshold of the guest chamber and turned to see him looking at the tapestry of her 10th marriage. The one she escaped through a poisoned goblet and a forged widow letter. His eyes held no judgment, only interest, like a person reading history in real time. She let that sit. It had been long since anyone regarded her past without fear. He entered the room and she closed the door gently. Not final, just resting. She returned to her chamber and sat on the edge of her bed as dawn drew slow, pale strokes into the world. For the first time in decades, she felt the future shifting one quiet inch at a time. Not because she planned it, but because it arrived on patient feet. And far down the hall the boy slept like someone who had never feared death.